Breaking news coming in from Peru. Peru's new government has declared a 30-day national emergency on Wednesday amid violent protests following the ouster of President Pedro Castillo suspending the rights of personal security and freedom across the Andean nation. So, emergency declared in the Andean nation of Peru. The past few weeks, in fact, the past few days have seen protests that have escalated with each day turning violent. And the government now taking the measure of declaring a 30-day state of emergency. And joining us now is Professor Sriram Aulia to take us through the significance of the declaration of the state of emergency, what it means in terms of fallout, what it means in terms of, all that has gone before as well. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Sriram. But first of all, the question I'd like you to tell us is, how do you look at these protests, first of all? Demanding somebody who has, the protesters are demanding that Pedro Castillo be released, even though there have been so many allegations of corruption against him. He may have denied them, but how do we look at those allegations now that the people's voices are saying that he should be released?
Yeah, it's a very polarized environment in many Latin American countries. Peru is one of them, Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela. The whole region, almost half of the country is with the left and the other half is dead against the left. So Pedro Castillo was elected by a very, very narrow, razor-thin margin, not even 1 percentage point in the presidential election. So he is a polarizing figure because half of the country does not accept his socialist inclinations and approach. So, and then he actually wanted ambitious overhaul of the constitution and of major policies in Peru and went for changes which would go against the interests of a lot of the people on the right. So the parliament, the legislature, the Congress, as it's called in Peru and in Latin America, they were obstructing his changes. So he actually went ahead to dismiss the legislature altogether, which is actually unconstitutional. So you can see the deadlock there between legislature and executive. And the people on the street, the protest, Rukma, that you're talking about, are die-hard followers of Pedro Castillo, because as far as they are concerned, their vote has been stolen. Because how can the Congress impeach and remove the president when he was actually elected by the people? So you see that this is a kind of and you are seeing a similar, confrontational politics emerging in other parts of Latin America. All of them have the same issue where, there's no consensus on the way forward for the country, what kind of policies, should they go for more wealth redistribution and socialistic approach, or should they remain with the status quo? So there are a lot of inequalities in Latin America, socioeconomic. So people are angry. There have been protests in Peru before the elections as well. And this seems to be a continuation of that because there is a lot of distress since the pandemic started, a lot of unemployment, high inflation, and people are not sure whether the institutions are going to deliver for them. So you see this frustration building up and coming out in this volcanic form. And emergency, I'm afraid, is going to actually exacerbate this crisis and make it worse because people believe, at least half of the country believes that their legitimate president has been robbed of his mandate and has been removed. While on the other hand, the legislature thinks that the president overstepped his limits. So balance of power or separation of powers between the arms of government, which is a fundamental for democracy, is right now missing. And that's why you are seeing these so-called soft coups and then attempted revolutions or counter-revolutions in Peru and elsewhere.
And the rise of the military. Now that the new government has given the military such immense power, what does that entail? What does that mean once again for democracy in this Andean nation? What does that mean in terms of the protests? Also seeing what has gone before this in most Latin American countries.
No, absolutely. The military has always been a critical player in that region. There has been a bad history of military coups and overthrows of civilian leaders and long dictatorships in the second half of the 20th century during the Cold War. And Latin America is only very recently, I would say like 20, 30 years only, they have restored civilian authority in most of these countries. So there have been dictatorships. The Alberto Fujimori, for example, was supported by the military in Peru, and he ruled for a long time. So there are, those ghosts that are coming back, and the military has lately stayed away from politics and allowed the civilian processes to go forward. But because of the deadlock, because of the polarization, because half of the country does not see eye to eye with the other half, then the military is sometimes invited to come in and be the kind of the veto player or the referee, and to decide and to stabilize the situation. So I hope that they will not go in for coups. There was a real fear of a coup in Brazil as well. If President Bolsonaro would not have accepted his narrow defeat in the recent presidential elections, there's already a kind of
right.
dictatorship in Venezuela. So you have this problem, and it's cyclical. It's coming back, and it's very dangerous because the military can say that we are bringing order and stability, but we know from history that their rule has been even worse than what the civilians have done. So I think if you see, there is a crisis of governance, there's a crisis of confidence in the institutions, and that is a time when extra constitutional moves can be made by incumbents to somehow survive, and they may use the military to try to remain in power by hook or crook, or by enforcing law and order, quote unquote, but in a way which crushes civil society and human rights and all these things. So there is a long history of human rights abuses by the military regimes in Latin America, and I do hope that that era is not going to come back. But there is a pretty good danger that unless there is consensus building and some kind of a modus vivendi between the different vying political factions of left and right, and unless there is a center, right now there is no center. And maybe the military will try to take over the center, because the left and the right are so much at odds with each other that military and other means, will be brought in that could try and break the tie, break the deadlock, and that's in itself dangerous. So Latin America, the whole region, especially since the pandemic, is facing this kind of a double whammy. There's an economic crisis, but also this complete collapse of faith in institutions and in the governing system, and that is a dangerous signal. Either you go for a revolution like a Marxist communist revolution, or for right-wing military coup, and I think it's in the worst interest of the people of that region if either of these things happen.
Right. Well, many thanks, Professor Sriram, for sharing your thoughts with us and for putting the events that we are seeing unfolding in Peru into perspective. We do understand the situation better now. Clearly, there's a need for consensus, as you say, but right now, the news that's coming in is that the new government in Peru, headed by Boluarte, has given the military new power amid the violent protests that we've seen erupting continuously.